It all started on a rainy afternoon in the middle of May, just a few weeks before the end of the school year. I remember it well because it was one of those gloomy days when everything seemed to drag on, and the rain kept us trapped inside the school. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth, and the constant drumming of rain against the windows made it impossible to concentrate on anything. So, when our teacher let us out early from study hall, I decided to kill some time in the library, a place I rarely visited. The library at Ashton High was a relic of the past. It had that old, musty smell of forgotten books and rarely used rooms, the kind of smell that clings to your clothes long after you've left. The librarian, Mrs. Wilkins, was a stern, gray-haired woman who always seemed to be watching you out of the corner of her eye, even when she wasn't looking in your direction. The place was quiet except for the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards underfoot. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just wandering the aisles, letting my fingers trail along the spines of the dusty books, when something caught my eye. There, tucked away on a shelf in the back corner of the library, was an old yearbook. It stood out because it didn't look like the other yearbooks we had for sale or display. This one was different. Its cover was faded and worn, the edges frayed, and the title, Ashton High 1985, was barely visible, as though it had been almost completely rubbed away over the years. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pulled it off the shelf, surprised by how heavy it felt in my hands. I carried it to one of the old wooden tables, the legs wobbling slightly as I set the book down. I flipped open the cover, and the first thing I noticed was the smell, a strange, earthy odor, like the pages had been soaked in something and left to dry out in a damp basement. But more than that, the book had an unsettling aura, a feeling I couldn't quite put my finger on. The first few pages were typical yearbook fair pictures of the principal, the faculty, and the various clubs and sports teams. The photos of the students were strange. Some of the faces were blurred, not in the way that happens with old photographs, but more like the faces had been deliberately smudged or scratched out. At first I thought it was just age, but the more I looked, the more I realized that only certain students' faces were affected. And it wasn't just one or two, it was dozens of them. I leaned in closer, squinting at the names beneath the photos. Most of the names were legible, but some had been completely obliterated, scratched out with such force that the paper was nearly torn through. It was unsettling, to say the least. I didn't recognize any of the names or faces, which wasn't surprising given that this yearbook was from before I was even born. As I sat there, flipping through the pages, I suddenly felt a cold draft, like someone had opened a window nearby. Shrugging it off, I returned to the yearbook, but now I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. There was a section near the back of the yearbook dedicated to the senior class. It was here that the blurring and scratching were the most prominent. Whole pages were filled with students whose faces had been almost completely erased, leaving behind only vague outlines. And then I noticed something even more disturbing. Beneath each of these photos, where the name should have been, there were faint smudges, as though someone had tried to write something and then violently erased it. A chill ran down my spine. I flipped to the very last page, and there, written in jagged, shaky handwriting, was a message that looked like it had been scrawled in a hurry. They are gone, and soon you will be too. I slammed the yearbook shut, my heart racing. What had I just found? Who were these students, and why were their faces scratched out? And more importantly, what did that message mean? I knew I couldn't just leave it alone. I had to find out more. Over the next few days, I became obsessed with the yearbook. I returned to the library after school every day, spending hours going through old records, newspaper clippings, and any information I could find about Ashton High from the 1980s. The more I dug, the more disturbing the picture became. It turned out that the students whose faces had been scratched out in the yearbook had all disappeared on the last day of school in 1985. According to the old newspaper articles I found, there had been a huge investigation at the time, but nothing was ever found, no bodies, no evidence, nothing. It was as if they had just vanished into thin air. And then, After a few months, the whole thing was quietly swept under the rug. The school moved on, the town moved on, and no one ever spoke of it again. But that wasn't all. I found other reports, buried deep in the archives, of similar disappearances dating back even further. Every few years, on the last day of school, a student would go missing. No one ever connected the dots because the disappearances were always treated as isolated incidents. But I could see the pattern, and it was clear something terrible was happening at Ashton High, and it had been happening for decades. As I continued my research, strange things started happening to me. It began with little things, books falling off shelves as I walked by, doors creaking open on their own, the lights flickering whenever I was alone. But then it escalated. I started hearing voices, faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, calling my name. At first I thought I was just imagining it, but the voices grew louder, more insistent, until they were impossible to ignore. One night I stayed late at the library, determined to find some answers. It was just me and Mrs. Wilkins, who was sitting at her desk, as usual, the dim light from her lamp casting long shadows across the room. I was deep in an old newspaper article when I heard a soft, rustling sound, like someone turning the pages of a book. I looked up, but no one was there. The rustling grew louder, closer, and I realized with a start that it was coming from the shelf where I had found the yearbook. I stood up, my heart pounding, and walked slowly over to the shelf. The yearbook was there, right where I had left it, but now it was open, the pages flipping on their own. I reached out to close it, but as soon as my fingers touched the cover, the pages stopped, falling open to the senior class section. And there, in the center of the page, was my picture. My face was blurred, just like the others, and beneath it, written in that same jagged handwriting, was the word gone. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short gasps. How was this possible? My picture hadn't been there before. I turned to look at Mrs. Wilkins, but she was gone, her desk empty. The lights in the library flickered again, and the room was plunged into darkness. Panic set in. I grabbed the yearbook and ran out of the library, my footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The voices were louder now, almost screaming, and I could feel something cold and unseen brushing against my skin as I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cool night air hitting my face like a slap. I looked down at the yearbook in my hands, and to my horror, the cover was now completely blank, as though it had never had any writing on it at all. I dropped it on the ground and ran home, not looking back. The next day, I tried to tell my friends what had happened, but they didn't believe me. They thought I was just stressed out from exams and end-of-year pressure. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew that I had to do something before it was too late. I spent the next few days trying to avoid the library, but it didn't help. The voices followed me wherever I went, growing louder and more urgent. I started seeing shadows out of the corner of my eye, dark figures that would disappear as soon as I turned to look. I was barely sleeping, barely eating, and I knew I was running out of time. On the last day of school, I made my way to the library one final time. I had to confront whatever was happening, had to find a way to stop it before it was too late. The library was empty when I arrived, the lights dim and flickering. I walked slowly to the back corner, where I had first found the yearbook, and there it was, sitting on the table, waiting for me. I hesitated for a moment, then reached out and opened the cover. The pages were blank, every single one of them. I flipped through them frantically, but there was nothing, no photos, no names, just empty, white pages. I was about to give up when I reached the very last page. There, written in that same jagged handwriting, was one final message: it's your turn. The lights in the library went out, plunging the room into darkness. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, and I turned to see a figure standing behind me, its face twisted in a silent scream. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. And then, everything went black. They found me the next morning, lying on the floor of the library, unconscious but alive. They said I must have had some kind of panic attack, but I know the truth. I know that I was spared, but only just. The yearbook was gone when I woke up, as though it had never existed. But I can still hear the voices, still see the shadows out of the corner of my eye. And every year, on the last day of school, I wonder who will be next. Because I know the curse isn't over. It never is. It was the last day of school. A day usually filled with excitement and the anticipation of summer. The halls of Lakewood High were buzzing with the usual end-of-year chaos, students scrambling to gather their things, say their goodbyes, and head out for the summer break. For me and a few friends, however, the day held a different kind of excitement, one that was not exactly the kind we'd anticipated. It all started when we were sitting in the cafeteria, casually discussing our plans for the summer. Among the usual chatter, Jake, our resident daredevil, brought up something that caught everyone's attention. He mentioned the old, abandoned wing of our school. Most students had forgotten about it, or if they did remember, it was only as a vague, dusty memory. It had been closed off for years, ever since the school had undergone renovations a while back. Rumors had floated around about strange occurrences in the wing's dark history, but no one had ever taken them seriously. "We should check it out," Jake said with a grin, his eyes glinting with the thrill of the unknown. "It's our last chance before everyone heads off for summer." At first, everyone laughed it off, dismissing it as another of Jake's wild ideas. But as the day wore on and the bell signaled the end of classes, the group of US Jake, Lisa, Mark, and me found ourselves gathered by the locked doors of the abandoned wing. The excitement of doing something that felt both thrilling and forbidden was too tempting to ignore. Jake had managed to get hold of a key from somewhere, no one asked how, and frankly, we didn't want to know. With a sense of rebellious adventure, we made our way to the old part of the school. The corridor leading to the abandoned wing was dimly lit, with flickering lights that seemed to struggle to stay on. The air was thick with dust, and the silence was broken only by the sound of our footsteps echoing off the walls. When Jake finally unlocked the door, it creaked open to reveal a darkened hallway. We hesitated for a moment, peering into the inky blackness before stepping through. As we walked, the temperature seemed to drop, and the air felt heavier, almost suffocating. The corridor was lined with old, neglected lockers, some of which were rusted shut. The walls, once painted a cheerful color, were now peeling and covered in grime. The first few rooms we explored were nothing out of the ordinary. There were dusty desks, broken chairs, and cobwebs hanging from every corner. It was what you'd expect from an abandoned school wing. But then we stumbled upon a door at the end of the hallway, slightly ajar. Inside was a room that looked different from the rest. It was clean, almost too clean, and the air inside felt unnervingly fresh compared to the rest of the wing. With a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, we entered the room. It was a small, windowless space, filled with old medical equipment that looked out of place in a school. There were rusty metal tables with straps attached, jars filled with what looked like old, murky liquids, and strange, faded diagrams pinned to the walls. In the center of the room was a large metal cabinet, its doors slightly ajar. Lisa, who was always the most curious of us, stepped forward and opened the cabinet. Inside were files and folders, neatly arranged but covered in a thick layer of dust. We pulled them out, one by one, and began to sift through them. What we found was disturbing. Each file contained detailed notes and photographs of students from years past. The images were grainy and old, but they clearly showed students who were restrained or unconscious, surrounded by the same medical equipment we had seen in the room. At first, we thought it might have been some sort of bizarre experiment, but as we continued to read, the horror set in. The notes described procedures and experiments conducted on students' tests with unknown chemicals, psychological evaluations that seemed to go beyond the ethical boundaries, and even physical alterations. Each entry was more unsettling than the last. Mark found a large, bound book that looked like a ledger. It detailed dates and names, but what stood out were the notes in red ink. They spoke of rituals conducted on specific dates each year. The language was cryptic, but it became clear that these rituals were meant to achieve some sort of outcome, possibly involving the students who were subjected to them. The deeper we delved into the files, the more we realized that these weren't just random experiments but part of a systematic, horrific practice that had been going on for years. There were even mentions of a final procedure that was supposed to take place at the end of each school year, involving the students who had been chosen for it. We were horrified but also fascinated. We continued to read, our initial curiosity giving way to a growing sense of dread. It was clear that whoever had been behind these experiments had taken great care to keep them secret. The more we uncovered, the more we felt like we were walking into something we weren't supposed to understand. Our exploration was interrupted when we heard a noise from the hallway. It sounded like footsteps. Someone was coming. We quickly shoved the files back into the cabinet and scrambled to hide. The footsteps grew louder, and we could see a shadow moving under the door. Our hearts pounded in our chests as we waited, barely daring to breathe. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. It was a man in a suit, looking around with a cold, calculating gaze. He didn't seem surprised to find the room as it was, and he walked straight to the metal cabinet. We watched in terrified silence as he methodically rearranged the files and closed the cabinet door. The man left as quickly as he had come, and we waited until we were sure he was gone before emerging from our hiding places. We were shaken, realizing that we had stumbled into something much larger and more sinister than we had anticipated. As we made our way back through the abandoned wing, the weight of what we had discovered felt almost too much to bear. We knew we had to leave, but the urge to understand more was strong. The files and documents had to be reported, and we had to tell someone about the horrific things we had seen. We left the abandoned wing with a promise to each other to come back later and investigate further. We knew that our discovery was only the tip of the iceberg, and that we had to dig deeper to uncover the full extent of the horrors that had been hidden in the dark corners of our school. The last day of school is usually a time for relief and excitement, a final stretch before the long summer break. Everyone looks forward to it, students and teachers alike. But that particular last day of school was different, one that none of us would ever forget. It was the day our principal, Mr. Williams, disappeared, leaving us trapped inside the school with something sinister lurking in the shadows. It started like any other last day. The hallways were filled with the usual chaos of students cleaning out their lockers, signing yearbooks, and making plans for the summer. The air buzzed with a mix of anticipation and nostalgia, the kind that only comes when something is about to end. I was with my friends, hanging out in the cafeteria, waiting for the final bell to ring and set us free. Mr. Williams, our principal, was a stern man, not exactly well-liked but respected enough. He was known for his strict rules and no-nonsense attitude, but that day, something seemed off about him. I noticed it when he made the final announcement over the intercom. His voice, usually firm and authoritative, had an edge to it that I couldn't quite place, something between urgency and fear. "Attention, students," he began, his voice crackling slightly through the speakers. "Before you leave today, I need everyone to gather in the auditorium. There is an important announcement I need to make." We all groaned at the thought of sitting through another boring speech, but we didn't have much choice. Reluctantly, we made our way to the auditorium, wondering what could be so important that it couldn't wait until next year. The auditorium was packed, with everyone crammed into the seats, chatting and laughing, completely unaware of the strange turn the day was about to take. Mr. Williams stood on the stage, looking out at us with an expression I had never seen on his face before, something between concern and unease. He waited for the noise to die down before he spoke again, his voice echoing through the room. "Students," he began, "I need you to listen carefully. What I'm about to say is very important." He paused, his eyes scanning the room as if he was searching for something or someone. For your safety, I'm going to have to ask you to remain in the building for a little while longer. The doors will be locked, and no one is to leave until I say it's safe." A murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd. Was this some kind of joke? Why would we need to stay in the school after the final bell? But the look on Mr. Williams's face told us this was no prank. Something was seriously wrong. Without another word, he turned and walked off the stage, leaving us all sitting there in stunned silence. A few minutes later, we heard the sound of the doors locking, a loud, metallic click that seemed to reverberate through the entire building. Panic began to set in as students started to realize that we were trapped inside. Some of us tried to leave anyway, rushing to the doors only to find them locked tight. The windows, too, were sealed shut, and it quickly became clear that we weren't getting out anytime soon. The teachers tried to keep us calm, but even they seemed just as confused and worried as we were. And then, just as the panic was starting to die down, the lights went out. For a moment, everything was pitch black, the darkness swallowing the entire room. Screams echoed through the auditorium as everyone fumbled for their phones, trying to light up the space. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, fear gripping me as I struggled to make sense of what was happening. When the emergency lights finally flickered on, casting the room in an eerie, dim red glow, Mr. Williams was gone. The stage where he had stood just moments before was empty, the doors behind it swinging slightly as if someone had just passed through them. A group of students rushed to the stage, calling out for Mr. Williams, but there was no answer. It was as if he had vanished into thin air, leaving us behind in the locked school. The teachers tried to take control of the situation, but it was clear they were just as frightened as the rest of us. We were trapped, with no way out and no explanation for what was happening. And then, the noises started. At first, it was just a faint scratching sound, barely audible over the murmurs of the panicked students. But as the minutes passed, the noise grew louder, more distinct, like something sharp dragging against metal. It was coming from the vents, echoing through the building like the sound of nails on a chalkboard. People started to panic again, rushing to the exits and banging on the doors, desperate to escape. But there was no way out, and the noise kept getting closer, more insistent, until it felt like it was right above us. A group of seniors decided to take matters into their own hands. They gathered a few others, myself included, and decided to search the school for another way out. We couldn't just sit there, waiting for whatever was making that noise to find us. Armed with nothing more than our cell phones for light, we made our way out of the auditorium and into the dark, deserted hallways. The school was eerily silent, the only sound the echo of our footsteps on the linoleum floor. The red emergency lights cast long, twisted shadows on the walls, making everything look more sinister than it already was. Every creak, every distant thud made us jump, our nerves already frayed from the fear and confusion. We split into smaller groups, each taking a different part of the school. I ended up with Jake, Lisa, and Mark, all of us determined to find a way out and figure out what was going on. We decided to start with the main office, thinking that if anyone had answers, it would be there. When we reached the office, we found the door slightly ajar. Inside, the room was in disarray, papers scattered across the floor, chairs overturned as if someone had left in a hurry. The principal's office door was closed, and there was a strange smell in the air, something metallic and faintly nauseating. Jake, ever the brave one, pushed open the principal's door. The room was empty, but it was clear that something had happened there. The desk was covered in scratch marks, deep grooves gouged into the wood, and the walls had the same marks, as if something with sharp claws had torn through them. But that wasn't the worst part. On the desk was a note written in what looked like Mr. Williams's handwriting. It was short, just a few words scrawled hastily across the page: "Don't open the doors. It's already inside." The meaning of those words hit us like a punch to the gut. Whatever had been making those noises, whatever was stalking us in the school, was already inside with us. And Mr. Williams had known he had locked us in to keep us safe, but now we were trapped with it. As we stood there, trying to process what we had just read, we heard the noise again, this time louder and closer. It was coming from down the hallway, getting closer with each passing second. We barely had time to react before the door slammed shut behind us, the sound echoing through the room. We were trapped. Jake tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. The room grew colder, the lights flickering as the noise grew louder, almost deafening. We huddled together, terrified, as the sound of scratching grew closer, followed by a low, guttural growl that sent chills down my spine. Whatever it was right outside the door, and it wasn't going away. We could hear it moving, its breath heavy and labored, as if it was sniffing us out. There was no escape, no way out, and all we could do was wait, hoping that it would pass us by. Minutes felt like hours as we waited in that dark, freezing room, our breaths shallow and quick. The noise eventually faded, but the fear lingered, a heavy weight on our chests. We knew we had to move, but the thought of leaving the relative safety of the office was almost too much to bear. Finally, we summoned the courage to open the door and peek outside. The hallway was empty, but the sense of dread remained. We decided to head to the cafeteria, hoping to find more students and safety in numbers. As we made our way through the darkened halls, we kept our ears open for any sign of the creature, our hearts pounding with every step. When we reached the cafeteria, we found a group of students huddled together, their faces pale with fear. They told us they had seen something, a shadowy figure, large and hunched, moving through the school, searching for something or someone. It had come close, but they had managed to hide before it saw them. We joined them, unsure of what to do next. The doors were still locked, and there was no sign of Mr. Williams or any of the teachers. It was as if we had been abandoned, left to fend for ourselves against whatever was stalking us. Hours passed in a tense, fearful silence. The noises would come and go, the scratching, the growling, always close but never quite finding us. Some students tried to break the windows, but they were reinforced, unbreakable. Others attempted to call for help, but their phones had no signal, as if something was blocking it. Finally, just as dawn began to break, the noises stopped. The silence was almost more unnerving, leaving us on edge, waiting for the next sound. But nothing came. We waited, not daring to move, until the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the windows. And then, without warning, the doors unlocked. The sound of the locks clicking open was almost surreal, as if it had never happened. We cautiously made our way to the doors, pushing them open and stepping out into the early morning light. The fear that had gripped us all night began to fade, replaced by a strange sense of disbelief. Had it all been real? Had we imagined the whole thing? But the scratches on the walls, the overturned desks, and the note in the principal's office were all too real. Whatever had happened that night, it wasn't a dream. Mr. Williams was gone, the creature was gone, and we were left with no answers, only the memory of that terrifying night. In the days that followed, the school was closed and the police were called in to investigate. They found no sign of Mr. Williams, and the official story was that he had simply left without explanation. The scratches and the damage were attributed to vandals, and the whole incident was quickly swept under the rug. But we knew the truth. We knew that something had been in that school with us, something that had taken our principal and left us behind. And as much as we tried to forget, to move on with our lives, the memory of that night would always stay with us, a reminder of the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface of our everyday lives.